Dame Anne Owers, Lady English, students, guests, fellows, staff. Welcome to the Jacqueline du Pré Music Building at St Hilda's College, Oxford, for the 2026 Lady English lecture. Judith English was the 9th principal of St Hilda's College from 2001 to 2007. And we are delighted that she's with us tonight, and she established a fund on retiring as head of house to support an annual lecture series on the broad theme of equality, which beautifully represents our mottos of excellence and equality. And thank you, dear Judith, for your foresight. And I know you just wanted, just so that you know where she is, Judith, would you like to wave at everybody? There we go. Thank you very much. It's lovely to see you, and you'll look forward to talking to everybody after the wonderful lecture we're about to hear. Our speakers have chosen to address this theme in a variety of ways, depending upon their professional or disciplinary vantage point. Former distinguished speakers include our inaugural lecturer in 2013, during Principal Sheila Forbes' time, Melissa Benn. And since then, we've heard from Baroness Brenda Hale, Bonnie Greer, Jane Bakewell, Pragna Patel, Baroness Tanny Gray-Thompson, and tonight's most distinguished speaker is Dame Anne Owers, who is a long-standing human rights campaigner. She's dedicated much of her career to understanding and addressing the challenges faced by people on the margins of society. Educated in County Durham, she went on to study history at Girton College, Cambridge. There are a few of us here today, before travelling to Zambia to work as a teacher. Over the course of her career, she's held several senior public roles, including serving as Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons from 2001 to 2010, and later as head of the Independent Police Complaints Commission, the IPCC, to which she was appointed in March 2012. She's also directed Justice, the UK-based organisation dedicated to human rights and to law reform, and has chaired Christian Aid. In recognition of her contributions to human rights, Dame Anne was first of all appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2000, and later promoted to damehood, Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 2009 New Year's Honours. She's an acclaimed distinguished lecturer, an honorary fellow of our college, having been appointed in 2008, and so we're absolutely delighted to welcome her to give the Lady English lecture with the title, Are Some Still More Equal Than Others? Dame Anne.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very aware that I'm standing in some very large shoes at the moment, and very impressive shoes. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. It's allowed me to think through some of the threads that have run through some of the very different kinds of work that I've done. In the voluntary sector, working on issues of immigration and nationality, and in criminal justice as Chief Inspector of Prisons and then Chair of the Independent Monitoring Boards of Volunteer Prison Visitors. Both of those roles and areas have involved looking at different kinds of exclusion, defining the people who belong, who are part of our country and our society, and those who don't and who aren't. And the way that we make those decisions, and the reasons why some people are more equal than others, is what I want to talk about today. I want to start the talk, though, with some personal reflections. When I chose the title, I was conscious of the changes that have happened in my own lifetime. As was just said, I grew up in a colliery village in County Durham. I was the first person in my family ever to go to university, soon followed by my 2 younger cousins. I don't believe that that was because there'd been a significant genetic mutation in the immediate post-war period. It was the reflection of conscious political and social changes, the opportunities that opened up to my generation, along with the free orange juice and the compulsory school milk. I went to Cambridge, as has just been said, where women at that point were 10% of the university population. Oxford, of course, was better with a staggering 15%. There are now around 50% in both places. Again, this is the result of a conscious decision not to bar women from the majority of colleges, rather than a sudden surge in female intelligence. Decades later, I became Chief Inspector of Prisons, and I still treasure two headlines. The Times reported, in some astonishment, "Woman to be Chief Inspector of Prisons." Later, when the Daily Mail wanted to dismiss the findings of a critical inspection report, its piece was headlined, "From Pit Village to Chattering Classes." How very dare she? I've no objection to the first, by the way, but I've never knowingly chattered, I hope. Indeed, that background has been important to me, and I suppose it's been the reason that much of my work has been with and on behalf of people who are marginalised, who for various reasons don't count, don't matter, who are not as equal as others. And I want to focus just on two of those areas. One is immigration and nationality, and the other is prisons. I was working on nationality and immigration, both locally and at national level, during the 1970s and 80s. There have always been times of national panic about immigration, and during this time it was centred on people who'd arrived perfectly legally from Commonwealth countries. I well remember the shock and disillusionment of people from the Caribbean who'd arrived perfectly legally on British passports by invitation to fill post-war labour shortages when they learnt that they'd actually lost their British nationality when their countries became independent and needed to buy it back if they wanted to reclaim it and their right to remain in the UK. I worked with a local advice centre, and I went around numerous church and community halls with an old-fashioned projector, helping people to fill in the voluminous forms that would allow them to reclaim, at a cost, the citizenship they'd been born with and secure their right to be here. But many didn't even know this was an issue. There was no big government public information campaign, so they carried on, often working in the NHS, transport and so on, bringing their children to join them, having families here. Until 5 or 6 decades later, they were threatened with deportation in what became known as the Windrush scandal. Because they'd come in as British or on their parents' passports, they hadn't needed permission, there was often no record, and precisely because they were in plain sight, not trying to hide or deceive anyone, they were easy pickings for the hostile environment of a government that wanted to show how tough it was. It took a public campaign to get the government to recognise this in what became known as the Windrush scandal, because the Windrush was one of the boats that brought those invitees to the UK. On the other side of the world, there were British nationals in newly independent East African countries who didn't qualify for citizenship of those countries on independence because they'd emigrated there from the Indian subcontinent to build railways, take on clerical roles, run small businesses, and so on. They remained British after independence, but in 1968 they lost the right to live in Britain because we invented something called patriality. Whether or not you had British nationality, you only had the right to live here if you'd a parent or grandparent born in the UK. The others were often referred to as British passport holders, as though they just happened to pick up a passport somewhere. You may well ask what point it is to have a nationality if it doesn't give you the right to live anywhere. Many of the newly independent countries gradually reduced the rights of those non-citizens, and Amin's Uganda actually expelled many of them. Some managed to come to the UK or to Canada, which was quite very generous, but many were stuck in limbo in a queue in India, waiting years for their turn, in an annual quota of entry vouchers in a scheme that was found by the European Commission of Human Rights to be racially discriminatory. So some British nationals were more British than others. Almost exactly 30 years later, those who are still alive and hadn't given up were finally given the right to use their British passports to enter Britain. But those who were unable to enter the country of their citizenship can't have failed to notice that while patriality excluded them, it included any Australians, Canadians, or New Zealanders who weren't British at all, had never been to Britain, but happened to have a grandparent born in the UK. So it was a very, very divisive and unequal scheme. And later on, during the Falklands War, we discovered that many of the people that we were defending had themselves been given the same ersatz citizenship as East African Asians and some British people in Hong Kong. And in some embarrassment, they were all hastily and retrospectively granted full British citizenship with rights of entry. When this differential and preferential treatment was pointed out, one member of the House of Lords defended it. He said, "I am reminded of the man who, on being asked to describe an elephant, said, 'I know one when I see it. I, too, know a full British citizen when I meet him.'" And in case you think this division into first and second class British citizenship is a thing of the past, I've recently been doing some work on counter-terrorism legislation with a large group of people, and I remember very much, and you may remember, the case of Shamima Begum, a British girl, born and raised in Tower Hamlets, who foolishly, at the age of 15, went to join the Islamic State. She's now in a detention camp in Syria, having lost all of her children. She's been deprived of her British citizenship. But under international law, you can't take away someone's citizenship if they would otherwise be stateless. She doesn't actually have another citizenship, but because she's of Bangladeshi heritage, it was argued that theoretically she could claim Bangladeshi nationality, even though Bangladesh has made clear they wouldn't accept her. So she's currently a citizen of nowhere. This has been described as, and I'm quoting, "fundamentally racist, denying the absolute Britishness of all those who are recent immigrants or their children," by someone called Jacob Rees-Mogg. In contrast, of course, her most extreme right-wing terrorism or planned terrorism is carried out by people of solely British heritage who therefore can't be deprived of British nationality, no matter how egregious or damaging their behaviour is. Other countries like France and the US have taken back all their citizens from the Islamic State with appropriate safeguards, de-radicalisation programmes, and where appropriate, criminal prosecution, not least because they believe it makes their countries less safe if their excluded citizens are there to be radicalised in Syrian camps. So in those countries, you can't easily deprive people of citizenship or shrug off responsibility for what they've become or what they've done. And this used to be the case in the UK. Before the 2000s, the last time deprivation was used was in 1972. Yet in the interim, there was the worst and most damaging terrorist activity the UK has ever seen, the Troubles in Northern Ireland, resulting in around 3,500 deaths and 47,000 injuries. Imagine if the government's response had been to tell members of terrorist organisations, whether the IRA or the UDA, that they had to be Irish. They could no longer be British. Because Irish law gives anyone born in Northern Ireland a right to Irish citizenship. That's one part of the background that I come from. The other part, of course, is prisons, a different kind of exclusion. The people that we physically exclude in prisons, and there are more and more of them. When I first started inspecting prisons in 2001, there were around 65,000 people in prisons. It was already on a rising curve, and that has accelerated. There are now nearly 90,000, twice as many as there were 30 years ago, and it's estimated that there'll soon be over 100,000. Last year, I was asked to do a report for the government on the resulting prison capacity crisis. We were literally running out of prison places, in spite of the fact that the system is hugely overcrowded, nearly 24% above the number of people that the system was designed to hold, so that more and more prisoners were in cramped and unsuitable cells. And this has largely been driven by sentence inflation, not crime inflation. All the statistics show that there are fewer crimes being committed, particularly serious and violent crimes, but average custodial sentence lengths have risen by 45%, and for the most serious offences by over 80%. Horrific and gruesome killings or gang-related stabbings rightly attract headlines, yet homicide rates are the lowest per million of the population since 1973, and violent crime is 75% lower than it was in 1995. So one obvious question about the burgeoning prison population is why, but the other is who. The truth is that many of the people in prisons lived excluded or marginalised lives long before they were physically excluded in prisons. I've said on many occasions, if you want to know what's going wrong in society, where the inequalities or unequal opportunities are, go visit a prison. The statistics are startling. Around a quarter of prisoners were taken into care as children, compared to 2% of the general population. Over half of those in prison regularly truanted from school, compared to around 5% of the general population. Nearly half had no qualifications. 2/3 were unemployed in the 4 weeks before custody. 13% had never had a job. 15% were homeless, compared with 4% of the rest of the population. Many had mental health or addiction problems. Nearly 2/3 of prisoners had used Class A drugs, and the latest annual report from the current Chief Inspector of Prisons notes that 56% of men and 74% of women in prison report mental health problems, and around half are estimated to be neurodiverse. This includes people with an acquired brain injury, often the result of violence in the home, as well as those with learning disabilities and difficulties. So those are the lives of people before they came into the prison system. And sadly, they too often return to prison because afterwards they're still living a marginalised existence. I remember a man in Cardiff prison who looked elderly but was in fact only in his 50s, who'd left prison homeless and was back in prison having thrown a brick through his solicitor's window. He said, "It's warm by here." I met a woman on one inspection who was now clean of drugs, looking forward to release. But when I went back on the next inspection, she was there again. Without support, she was back on drugs and had repeatedly shoplifted until finally she was returned to prison so someone could get her clean again. Too often, prison provides respite care, not just for prisoners, but for the agencies that would otherwise have had to bear the cost, literally, of supporting them. Mental health and addiction services, those that should be providing housing and employment. Fewer than half of those who left prison returned to settled accommodation, and around 15% were homeless or sleeping rough. To no one's surprise, 2/3 of those without settled accommodation end up back in prison. And without a home, getting a job or getting your family back together is that much more difficult. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we should just wring our hands and feel sorry for people who are living antisocial lives, harming themselves and the rest of us, stealing from shops, pocketing our mobile phones after getting involved in county lines gangs. Far from it. I'm saying the evidence is that if you don't tackle these inequalities early and often, and do so outside prison, in the places where they start and end, you'll simply be contributing to a vicious circle. But in fact, there have been some improvements in the last 25 years, and I want to look at those and what they perhaps can teach us. One remarkable and largely unnoticed change since I stopped inspecting is the huge drop in the number of children under 18 in prison. In 2006, there were over 3,000 imprisoned children. There are now around 400. Yet all the evidence shows that in spite of county lines and gang activity, juvenile crime has also decreased. Proven offences are down by 61% over the last 10 years. So what's changed? The focus has moved from prison to not prison, from hiving young people off as criminals so that dealing with their problematic behaviour becomes the responsibility of all community organisations, schools, local authorities, health services, not just police and the criminal justice system. There's a really interesting longitudinal study from the University of Edinburgh, a study of youth transitions and crime, which has tracked young people over a 25-year period. Its most striking finding is that the thing that most prevents young people becoming habitual criminals is to keep them out of the criminal justice system. Early formal contact with police and criminal justice is the single best predictor of a criminal future. By contrast, supporting children and families to deal with the underlying issues and inequalities can identify vulnerabilities and provide support without badging children as criminals. The Scottish study found that over half the young people who admitted to having done something criminal had stopped doing so by the time they were 18, and the majority of those had remained under the radar of the police and the criminal justice system. I suspect most of us have done things when we were young and foolish that we wouldn't want to be defined by now. And the experience in England and Wales seemed to support this. However, all that changes once a young person reaches 18. They're supposed to be fully functioning adults at the point they blow out the candles on their 18th birthday cake, whatever their previous family and personal history, and all that support falls away. And yet, the number of young adults in prison has also dramatically decreased over recent years. 20 years ago, there were nearly 8,000 18 to 21-year-olds. around 10% of the prison population. By 2026, there were just over 3,000, just over 3% of the population. Again, assuming there hasn't been a genetic change over those 20 years, what has changed? One factor may well be that today's young adults were yesterday's Sure Start children, beneficiaries of a programme that focused on supporting families in children's early years. Or it may be that the result of the changes in youth justice, that these young people were not given a criminal identity and profile at an early age, and therefore not physically excluded in prisons or defined as criminals. So you don't reinforce and solidify the kind of inequality that I was talking about earlier. There have been tentative steps in this direction in relation to women in prison. Nearly 2/3 of them have not been convicted of violent offences, and there are some specific issues that sit behind their imprisonment: violence in the home, drug and alcohol problems, and many, like the rest of the prison population, have been in care. There's a high prevalence not just of mental health and addiction, but also of self-harm. Women are only 4% of the prison population, but account for 1/4 of all self-harm incidents, which have more than trebled over the last 10 years. Whereas men under pressure tend to hurt each other, violence in prisons has increased alongside the increase in population. Women under pressure tend to hurt themselves. And there's a generational effect of women's imprisonment. Around half of the women in prison have children under 16. And it's not always true that when they're in prison there is someone outside that keeps the home fires burning and looks after those children. Only half of women leaving prison leave to settled accommodation. So ever since the noughties, there have been calls for a different approach to women's offending, starting with a report by Baroness Corsten in 2004, with a recommendation for smaller, more local, more permeable prisons. Though it hasn't happened as intended, the women's prison population has stabilised over the last 15 years, remaining steady at about 4,000. And that's at least partly because of a different approach. The work of community-based women's centres, again jointly funded by local authorities, health and charities, as well as central government. Women who used the centres reported feeling included, not excluded, less isolated, more able to tackle the problems that can lead to offending and reoffending. There are a lot of funding challenges for these centres, and they lack the statutory base of the youth justice system. But recently the government has set up a Women's Justice Board with the stated aim of reducing women's imprisonment and focusing, as with young people, on addressing multiple and complex needs, early intervention and diversion. You can't argue with that, or the need for a specifically women-centred approach to offending that addresses the fundamental inequalities that brought them there and are likely to have a generational impact. But hang about, what about men? I've already set out the background and inequalities of the adult male prison population, the social, economic, mental health and addiction problems that often brought them into prison and are likely to bring them back. This is the demographic that's driven up the prison population. Once they've left the support structure of the youth justice system, they're on their own. And linking back to my earlier points about race discrimination in nationality law, I should also mention the disproportionate racial mix in prisons. Black men are 4% of the UK population, but 12% of the prison population. And that starts at the front end. The Inspectorate of Constabulary has found that black people were 18 times more likely than white people to be stopped and searched without needing reasonable grounds. Of course, many of those searches will reveal, for example, illegal substances. But what would a proportionate number of searches of white young men, perhaps not a million miles away from here, show? It's been estimated that if the prison population mirrored the community, there'd be 9,000 fewer men and boys in prison, the equivalent of 5 large male prisons. So my question would be, why do the arguments about looking at causes, not effects, investing upstream in prevention and downstream in resettlement support, why don't they apply equally to men? Each prison place costs £60,000 a year on average, annual operating costs of £5 billion. We're spending £10 billion on building new prison places at a cost of around £60,000 per place. I think you could buy a decent 3-bedroom house in and around Oxford for that, according to Rightmove. During the noughties, there was a movement called Justice Reinvestment, which actually started in some US states and spread to the UK. And its aim was specifically to move resources from prisons to the community. to tackle the roots of offending behaviour, and there were some promising local pilot schemes set up, along with some problem-solving courts taking the same approach. But sadly, the pilots never really got out of harbour before they were sunk by the tidal wave of more and more imprisonment, soaking up resources rather than reinvesting them. So I will end this part of my talk by saying that there have been serious and successful attempts to address inequalities in criminal justice, but some are still more equal than others, and the lessons learned or being learned in relation to young people and women are just as applicable to men. But unless you think I've forgotten about fundamental social and gender inequalities that still exist, I started by describing my own experience of being the first woman to be the Chief Inspector of Prisons. But was this a breakthrough or an anomaly? A quarter of a century later, all my successors have been white, privately educated men. I've nothing but admiration for the way that they have robustly and independently reported on a prison system that is now even more overcrowded and dysfunctional. But I'm just asking, where is the pipeline for a diversity of chief inspectors? Maybe, like criminal justice and nationality, battles are never completely won, and still are some more equal than others. Some are still more equal than others. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, of course. Yeah, if anyone's got any questions or comments, I'm very happy to.
I'll ask a question then, without the microphone. To what extent do you think commercial privatisation has affected the equality and sort of the move towards an Americanised model?
Of prisons?
Of prisons.
I certainly think without it, we couldn't have built as many prisons as we have. It just wouldn't, we're still very, very long, it still takes much, much longer than people say, and costs much more than people say to build prisons. I think without the private sector, we couldn't have got there. And there have always been arguments about whether you should make profit out of prisons.
Thanks, that was a great talk. I wondered, the government's only recently lifted quite a long-standing embargo on universities being involved in prison education. I wondered where you would like prison education to go.
Right. How long have you got? Well, first of all, I'd like it to go. I mean, one of the things that really shocked me when I went back into prisons to do my report, the report I produced last year, was how little education there now is. The number of prisoners who are spending 23 hours a day locked in their cells and are not getting access to any kind of activities, whether that's sort of formal education or training, in skills training, that will make them more likely to be able to get a job when they leave than they were. I mean, I said about the number of children and young people in prison and the number of prisoners generally who've missed out on school because they've truanted or not or been excluded. A big number of school exclusions. So I think involvement in education, in prison education, is really, really crucial. And I also think that schemes that bring people in from the outside to do it are really important. People working in prisons, whatever their intentions, and a lot of them have really good intentions and a lot of them do really good work, but you do get rather trapped in that prison mentality. And I've always really liked, I talked about permeability of the outside coming in is really important. I mean, it teaches both ways, doesn't it? I think going into prisons taught me a lot that I never knew before. Absolutely did. But also it means that there's a variety of skills being offered to people who are in prison. So I think those schemes were really important.
You spoke about offenders you met in prison who showed they'd kind of performed and were ready to integrate into society, and then they go out and they reoffend and they're back in prison. Do you think reforms that needed to be made to the probation service to kind of account for that better and to kind of follow up post-prison?
Do I think, sorry, that...
Sorry, reforms to the probation service would help in those kind of situations?
Well, the answer is yes, reforms and also resources. I mean, prisons are visibly overcrowded. You know, you can tell when you can't literally squeeze any more people in. I mean, the time I did this capacity report, they were literally within 3 days of running out of prison places, in which case the whole of the criminal justice system would have ground to a horrible halt. But no one notices the equivalent sort of overcrowding and capacity crisis in probation, which is really acute. A lot of experienced probation officers were lost. There are huge gaps in London probation, particularly, is massively short of people, and also short of experience. That experience which lets you know when you really need to be worried about something or someone, and when you just want to mind your back by saying, well, okay, we'll send them back to prison, because just in case. So it's resource and it's experience, and it's. I mean, probation used to be a welfare service. It was developed and invented as a welfare service. It became a sort of policing, almost a policing service. It's moving back, but it does need. It's one of the things that needs huge resource. But then so do the other community activities that sit around, because probation can't deal with mental health problems. It can't deal very well with addiction problems. So you need a whole sort of ecosystem, really, around that.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you're optimistic about the potential for the 2026 Sentencing Act to be able to alleviate the pressures on the prison population, as you spoke about. If not, what could be done further? Yeah, I want to know your thoughts. Thank you.
I'm cautious. I wouldn't want to be entirely negative about the Sentencing Act, but what that does, it focuses on short sentence people. Now, it's absolutely true that it's completely pointless sending someone to prison for what's supposed to be a 12-month sentence is in fact a 6-month sentence, during which they could lose their job, they could lose their house. They're going to go back worse. You know, short sentences are pretty pointless. But there are two problems. One is that people who are sentenced for short periods of prison have usually been through an awful lot of encounters with agencies before then which have not worked. And unless there's something else there, unless not prison is invested in, the problems those people have will continue to manifest themselves in ways that are likely to bring them back into prison. So you can't save money by dealing with people who get short sentences differently. You've got to invest it properly in the things that will stop them going there in the first place and stop them from coming back. That's my first point. The second point is that they are actually quite a small proportion of the prison population. What's really driving the prison population is sentence inflation. And I'm not sure that anybody, as I said, minimum sentences for homicide are now twice as high as they were when I started inspecting prisons. I don't believe people are twice as dead as they were 25 years ago. But we have become much more punitive as a society, and that's a ratchet that I find it difficult to think it will be. What's happening at the moment is it's being done by stealth, in the sense that sentences are passed by the court, and then you only have to serve a third of them in prison, which I'm not arguing with, but it is a way of not reducing sentences, but kind of reducing the prison part of sentences. But also it does mean that without support for the probation service and others that we've just talked about, the chances of those people then coming back into prison to serve the rest of their sentence are pretty high.
Hello, thanks for the talk. Actually, my question is quite related to things you were just speaking about. So So you mentioned a statistic that sentencings have dramatically increased.
Mm-hmm.
I think you also had mentioned that that homicides had also reduced a great deal. I'm not very well versed in arguments concerning these topics, but intuitively I might think that maybe one motivation for increasing a sentencing is for deterrence. I was wondering perhaps if you could speak a little bit more to, I guess, how you see the balancing between sort of motivations for deterrence and at the same time this problem that we're seeing of overcrowding prisons.
I believe that there are, for some people, the thought of going to prison is a huge deterrent, and that can work. But for the kind of people that I've seen in prison, I don't think it's a deterrent, and I specifically don't think it's much of a deterrent when you look at homicide. When you look at the reason that homicides happen, they are often domestic homicides. There are those that are very much related to gang culture and people who are, you know, very scared of each other and live lives of on the brink all the time of serious harm. I don't believe there's any evidence at all that, I mean, when we abolished the death penalty, you know, it was argued very strongly, well, you know, it operated as a deterrence. I don't think that did, and I don't think in terms of homicide it does. I think there's a limited effect, but basically for the majority of people, things that draw them into crime are the attraction, not attraction, but the things that are pushing them in that direction. Both social, economic, familial are much stronger than, and indeed for some people, as I said, it's a sort of, it's a bit of an oasis of calm in a life of. Some of the kids that I've seen in prison are safer in prison than they ever were outside. They were terrified outside, and at least somebody is looking after them. So I'm not a great believer you've got to have a criminal justice system. Don't get me wrong, but going upwards and upwards and upwards with sentencing. I think for most people, it's going to prison or not going to prison has quite a deterrent effect.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Thank you for an absolutely wonderful lecture. I'm going to be slightly naughty and ask a couple of questions, if I may. The first one is about the passports and nationality, and I wondered, if you had a magic wand, what would you do to make it more equal? And my second question is, how much would it cost to fix the prison system? Does anybody know, and who would know? Would you know more than others? And what would your first or most important investment be? So I'm so sorry, these are two rather unfair questions, but so you can choose whichever one you wish to start on. Thank you so much.
Remind me about the first one again.
The first one was about having a magic wand and trying to make things more equal with passports. And I've got in my back of my head Hong Kong students, for example. Also, I mean, the Taiwanese have no link to us, but I'm aware a certain person is about to go to another certain country that thinks that they might feel that Taiwan should belong to them, and they were until 1997. All of those things. So I'm aware of some of those issues, and again, some of the examples you gave us are absolutely horrendous and so unfair. So I thought I'd give you a magic wand for the passports, and I'd ask about the money for the prisons. For prisons,
okay. Magic wand for passports. Well, I think we are discovering we often produce this magic wand, although reluctantly and rather belatedly. I mean, people from Hong Kong have been now given a right to come. I went to Hong Kong to talk to people before the handover, and I was sort of horrified by. And when you talk to people, it's that feeling of it's a real feeling of betrayal. It's a kind of feeling of, look, you know, we, particularly people who came to Hong Kong to support, you know, often from the Indian subcontinent, to support the government. It's a real sort of feeling of sadness. But we have, you know, both with what we call the East African Asians and with people from Hong Kong, we grudgingly and eventually sort of, but not all of our, I mean, there are still a lot of our citizens, including Jimmy Lau, who's now in prison, who are suffering in Hong Kong. So there isn't a magic wand, but it is, we do have a different view to those territories than, for example, the French do. I mean, the French overseas territories, they're all French citizens. They vote in French elections. Ours don't. So it's, yeah, magic wands I'm short of, but actually being, you know, trying to be equal, trying to be fair. And I think the voucher scheme in India was very, very unfair, as were things like the virginity testing of young women who wanted to come here as brides, for example. Because as fiancés, because if you were a fiancé, it was easier to come in as a fiancé from the Indian subcontinent than it was to come in as a bride, and so there was evidence that young women were tested to check whether they were virgins or not, because of course if they weren't married they must be virgins. So those kind of things that happen that you sort of roll your eyes at now and think, how on earth could this ever have happened? In terms of investment, I mean, my thing would always be about reinvestment. I mean, it costs an awful lot to run prisons, and to run prisons in which at the moment people are going to be locked away 23 hours a lot of people are going to be locked 23 hours in their cell, doing nothing that is positive, nothing that can actually change their lives for the better. And quite likely the experience of having been in prison will change their lives for the worse, because if they had a job, they may have lost it. If they had a home, they may have lost it. If they had a family, they may have lost it. So my answer would always be to reinvest those resources where it matters in the community. Prevention is always better, and if we can do it for children and young people, you know, it has worked. Crime among young people has dropped, and there are now very few in prison.
So this means that we need to invest in those services and not allow them to be reduced to almost nothing. They have to be properly functioning services in sufficient quantity. So that also needs government investment.
It does.
Does anybody know how to do those sums, though?
Well, that's the big problem. You've actually put your finger on the big problem, because the big problem with justice reinvestment is that you've still got to keep the old system running while you put money into something different. So you've got, if it's going to work, you're going to be double funding for a bit, and that's I think the thing that has. But you could still do it in incremental stages. You could do something in incremental stages.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I just wanted to make a slightly contrary point and wonder, in your career, have you spent time with victims associations or victims groups, and whether you could reflect on that? If somebody had murdered or raped somebody close to me, I would want them locked up 23 hours a day.
Of course, yeah.
And your statistics are all about, you know, a third or a half or this sort of thing, and how you then are able to distinguish, I guess, those deserving prisoners and those undeserving prisoners, if I'm able to put it that way.
Well, I hesitate to use it in that way, because I think most people, I hope, the vast majority of people in prison are there because they've done something they shouldn't have done. There are some people who are wrongly convicted, but they are a frighteningly small minority. I think your point about victims is a really good one, because yes, of course, if a child or grandchild of mine was horribly, you know, want the worst possible thing to happen to that person. That's why we have a criminal justice system, so that we don't actually have people exercising personal vengeance. And actually, when you talk to victims very often, what many of them will say is, we really do not want this to happen to anyone else. And so victims too have an interest in trying to create a system whereby it's less likely that other people will suffer the horrific example that they have. One of the comments that was made recently by one of the parents of one of the children who was killed by Valdo Calacane was about, you know, why couldn't the mental health services have looked after him better? He was showing all the signs, there were all the signs there necessary to take action that need not have resulted in the deaths of 3 children. You know, so I think you have to recognise the pain of victims. I mean, you can't. One of the things that's sometimes been done is restorative justice, where victims have talked to people who have harmed them. And that has helped, actually, them, that's a bit of understanding. Nothing can make it better, but at least to sort of understand where it's come from.
Many of these seem to be when the silos fall apart between particularly local government and national government.
Yep.
Again, you don't have a magic wand, obviously.
No.
But what would you do with a stroke of your brush to fix it? What would you sort of do to try and stop the silos and make it work?
Well, I think the only sort of the only magic brush that I can see is where you do resource everybody who's responsible to be able to deal with it at the front end. I mean, that sounds an awful lot simpler than it is.
Yeah, but clearly the age of majority is the problem. When someone says, "Oh, you're 18, not our problem."
You're 18, not our problem. Yes, absolutely. I can't speak for everyone in the room who's a parent, but I don't believe that I suddenly thought that my children, when the minute that they were 18, were suddenly completely didn't need anything at all from anybody, and were you may have some wonderful students in this college, but you know, people grow, people change. So I think what we've learnt from that is the importance and the importance of early years as well. That, you know, we may not be able to do much for the generation that's currently in prison, but we could start doing quite a lot for the generation who might end up in prison. And I'm encouraged by the fact that the government is talking about bringing back the Sure Start programme, which really died the death because it wasn't resourced. That thing where you involve the whole family at an early stage and looking at, you know, how you can deal with things before they become problems rather than afterwards. It's always much more expensive sorting out a problem before. It's like, you know, it's like if you don't deal with the slightly dripping tap in your bathroom and your house floods, it's always better to deal with the drip first rather than have to call in someone for the flood.
Do I need a microphone? So people who are going to help resolve the issues. You talked about not having enough people wanting to serve in the probation service, and I think it's true in many areas around the criminal justice system. And there's that face-to-face interaction that is really important, and that can't be done by a robot or a computer or AI or anything else. So how do we make a job or a career more attractive to be able to encourage people to train in that area? And are there any again, silver bullets or magic wands with AI to be able to make everything a little bit more efficient? And I realise the jury's still out on that, and maybe one can't answer that. But I am very interested in the question of how to make a career more interesting or a job more interesting to people, that they can get rewards in both directions. You know what I mean? Feel fulfilled.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think also, starting, I mean, I think in some, for example, in some Scandinavian countries, if you want to work in a prison, you have to do the equivalent of a degree. In our system, if you want to work in a prison, you get 6 weeks basic training and then you're out on the landings. And you might be 18. You might just be 18. It's not really a recipe for people being confident enough to deal with some pretty tricky characters. I mean, I've been very fair, I think, about the kind of people that are in prison. But, you know, they are a mixed and not entirely easy to manage bunch of people. So something really to invest in training would be one of the things that I would say, and that would make it feel more like a career. And there was a system that was started to encourage graduates to join the prison service, but I'm afraid that's gone like many other things. But that's certainly something that I think could be looked at, because it's a terribly important job. I mean, you're asking people, you know, to deal with some of the most difficult and damaged people in our society, and to try and get them to a different place. And all of you who are educators know that, you know, that requires a lot of investment.
Can I ask another large question? Do you have a theory about the causes of sentence inflation? And what part does the Home Office play in all this? Or is it simply a matter of politics?
I think it's a matter of politics. I think it is one of those things that is frighteningly easy to inflate sentences, often on the back of a particularly horrific and dreadful crime. It's frighteningly easy to inflate them. It is really difficult to pull them back. And I'm afraid all governments have really since the 1990s have been very, very anxious to pull that trigger, to respond to, you know, as you were saying, you know, some horrific crimes with really terrible victims, and to have somebody's law, which then means that. And the problem is that once you do that, it's usually homicides. Once you start upping the tariff for homicide, you pull things up behind it, because you then have to make it equivalent for serious and violent offences, for violence against the person. So everything then gets pulled up on the back of something which was truly awful. So I'm afraid it is frighteningly easy to increase sentences, and terribly difficult to bring them back.
Does this happen in all countries, or are we
No,
particularly
it doesn't. It's happened in America a lot, and we've tended to follow the American pattern. It hasn't happened so much in other countries. I remember going to Germany, for example, where there were sort of models of the way that particularly you dealt with young people outside a criminal justice system and so on. So it hasn't happened so much in other countries. It has happened. I think in most Western countries there has been an increase in punitive sentencing. But we're way ahead of, we certainly win the sentencing prize in Europe, and lack sufficient alternatives, I think.
Hi, on the back of the idea of sentence inflation, obviously we're trailing behind the European average in terms of the minimum age of criminal responsibility at age of 10. do you foresee a reality in which we'll catch up to the European average of 14 to 16? Or do you think that we will, I mean, maybe a lot of people in this room remember the James Bulger case, which was, I think, the impetus behind that.
Yes, it was.
But what do you reckon is the future for the minimum age?
Well, I think, I mean, you're absolutely right. But in fact, in practice, although the age of criminal responsibility is frighteningly low, and it used to be 8 in Scotland, it's been brought up now to the magic age of 10. But as I've said, in practice, we're tending not to use the criminal justice system for those young people anyway. I mean, they are still criminal responsibility, but a lot of work goes into diversion from the criminal justice system. A lot of work goes into looking at their backgrounds, which is why far fewer of them end up in prison, and those that do, they've committed pretty serious offences. So I think in a way we've sort of swerved it a bit, in the same way that we've swerved long sentences by saying, well, yes, we're going to pretend you're going to be in prison for 3 years, but actually you're only going to be in prison for 1. We've still got the age of criminal responsibility, but we're not actually criminalising young people in the way that we used to. And Scotland has actually led the way in that very much because in Scotland the probation service is still a social service. It's still part of social services rather than part of the criminal justice system, and that's true for adults as well as children.
Thank you. So my question was related to like immigration and, well, non-citizens and usual sort of, fear that, the immigration causes the increase in crime. And so what does this statistics say? And in prison population, you mentioned that, I mean, in some ways you have, for example, like, more black people in prison because they are searched more, or for that sort of part of the societal prejudice, but extending it to all kind of immigrants and maybe not British nationals, and the criminal situation in UK. What's the reality?
The answer is I don't know. I don't know what the statistics are, and I've always been quite careful not to not to make statements when I don't know the answer to. So that's one thing I don't know the answer to. What is? I mean, I think there are two things that I'd say in relation to certainly race and criminal justice, and one is again about investing early in families that may be becoming dysfunctional, in families that may be suffering from sort of deprivation, to get that early, and the second is who you notice and who you search, for example. But I don't know what the statistics are around crime and immigration at all.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for a really lovely, good talk. Very interesting. My question is, and you've probably just touched on it in terms of Scotland, and I don't know the answer to this, by the way. Are there any shining beacons within the devolved parts of the UK that are leading the way, maybe not on the women and young people, but perhaps on men and prison populations, or are they all very similar?
They're all very similar within the UK. There's nowhere. I did quite a bit of work in Northern Ireland prisons, and the imprisonment rate is pretty high. It's pretty high there too. I don't think there's anywhere within the UK that, and Scotland has got a very, very high. In spite of the fact they're doing this fantastic work with young people, the adult prison population has been high. Largely because actually criminal justice law is set in Westminster rather than in the devolved administrations. I mean, some criminal law in Scotland is different, but by and large, certainly Wales follows England very, very closely. So I don't think there's. I wish I could think of. I mean, there were some really good. I mean, Northern Ireland did lead the way in dealing with children and young people, because they were doing the sort of wraparound service way before before it became common in England. But I'm not thinking of anything else.
I think probably it's time now to say thank you very much, Dame Anne, for an absolutely splendid lecture. I must say we all thoroughly enjoyed learning about your areas of expertise. And as I said, equality is something that's really important to us, and being more equal than others, something that really challenges us to think. And we would very much hope that you carry on with your wonderful work and impact on these inequalities. And we certainly will be doing our best from wherever we are to be in support. So thank you so much. And if I'd invite everybody for another round of applause.
I should have said a special thanks to Janet Owers, who was part of trying to work with my inequalities when I was at Girton, without whom I would not be here. So.